Welcome back, our dear viewers. In today's edition of The Breakfast Show, we are going to talk about a very interesting topic, which is the mysteries of the Greek and Roman temples in Egypt. We are going to know more about these temples and the misconception that sometimes we are having about these temples in Egypt. To shed more light, we are very much like to have our dear guest in studio, Mr. Samir Abbas, Egyptologist. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Good morning, Mihesti.
First, Mr. Samir, can you tell us what are the Greek-Roman temples in Egypt?
So, first of all, we have different types of temples in Egypt. Egypt is full with hundreds of temples. That is what has survived.
Yes.
And there is ruins of maybe 1,000 other temples in Egypt. And so these temples, most of these temples built by the ancient Egyptian kings, people, and along the Nile Valley. But there is other temples, other group of temples, which is from archaeological point of view, we call them the Greek-Roman temples. Mm. These are the temples which I would like to talk about today. So first of all, shedding some light about the Greeks and Romans in Egypt. Please. So Egypt has been invaded by the Greeks. More specific, like to name the leader who invaded Egypt is Alexander. And shortly after his death, his successor, Ptolemy, in Egypt, come from a Greek background as well. He started a rule for him and his family after completing the city of Alexandria to be the capital of Egypt. And they started a rule of a dynasty, lasted for nearly 300 years. Yeah. Ptolemy the first, the second, the third, and so on until Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, the seventh. And that was considered the rule of the Greeks, which is, myself, I prefer to call them the invasions. Okay, just to put that in the price, in the right contents. You know, the Greek invasions in Egypt. After the collapse of this dynasty, Egypt has been invaded again by the Romans, and that was even more difficult time. So if we will compare between the Greeks control and Romans control, the Greeks is better relatively. You know, I'm not saying that they are actually good to rule Egypt. But in comparison, because the Greeks in Egypt, or more specific, the Ptolemies in Egypt, they focus on preserving and developing Egypt for their personal interest, because they moved, or they considered Egypt as a capital of their growing empire, of the Ptolemies' growing empire, as separated from the Greek empire. But the Romans, no. The Romans considered Egypt as a district, or better to say as a state, or as under their control, while everything in Egypt should be taken away to the Roman Empire. So the difference is the Greeks, in a simple version, the Greeks developed things and kept it in Egypt. The Romans didn't care to develop things in Egypt and everything taken out of Egypt, and that's why the Roman era was much more difficult on the Egyptians. So now we'll come back to our main subject. That was a background of the difference between, and we are talking about the 3rd century BC, like 2,300 years ago, when the Greeks invaded Egypt, and the Romans took over after the death of the suicide of Cleopatra around the 1st century AD until the 7th century AD 642. So that was a very long period of Egyptian history.
Of course.
And in that period, there is temples built in Egypt. And these temples, like the temple of Edfu, the temple of Komombo, the beautiful temple of Philae on the islands in Aswan, these temples is not built during the native rule of the ancient Egyptian kings. And when you go there, you don't see native Egyptian kings. You see Ptolemies, Greek and Roman kings dressed like pharaohs, and their names written in hieroglyphics in cartouches, which is very confusing. It's very much, just very much like as if the Ottomans, when they invaded the Constantinople, and instead of converting the churches there into mosques, they start building new churches. It is as if when the British...
They were trying, can you say here, to gain the sympathy of the natives?
That's a very good point, actually. The reason is complicated, and that's what I would like to... So it's also, and there is also another example that came to my mind, which is more recent, like the British invaded Egypt, and they start building big mosques in every city of Egypt. It doesn't make sense. So, especially that the Greeks and Romans, both of them, they come from a completely different religious and cultural background of the ancient Egyptians. They have their own gods, they have their own cult, they have their own religious practice. And when they decided to live in Egypt, they built a new city, Alexandria, according to their own taste, their own style, not to the Egyptian style. So to dig more in this subject, we have to, first of all, my personal perspective, the Greeks and Roman kings had nothing to do with building these temples. Even when many of the history books calling these temples Greek and Roman temples built by Ptolemy III, the fourth and the fifth and so on, because their names is there, but for me that's not an evidence. And that's what I will explain why they haven't paid any money or any wealth to erect any column in these temples. So the first evidence, which is very important, that there is some names of kings, which is we know for sure that they never made it to these temples, and their names on the walls of this temple. I will mention Philip Arrhidaeus. Philip Arrhidaeus is a very unknown king. He's Greek. He is a half brother of Alexander, and he had a mental error, by the way, and he was official inheritance of Alexander Empire. And he never left his hometown, and his name written in the innermost shrine of Karnak temple as the official ruler of Egypt.
Why?
Okay. So I will answer that right now, but that's a very another example of Alexander himself. So his name on a temple on Elephantine Island.
Yes.
So his name on the shrine in the innermost part of Luxor temple, and we don't have any evidence that Alexander he made it that far in Egypt into Luxor and into Aswan as well. And there is many other like Hadrian and many other kings as well, Romans. You can find their names on shrines and temples, and we don't have a single evidence that's made
now,
there.
Mr. Abbas, we can see a map for these temples as you brought it with you.
Sure, sure.
And it shows us the places of the temples that belong to the Roman Greek era.
Sure. So the map
Yes.
I brought with me is actually I made like a circle, like a black one, which is showing the most important temples. As I mentioned, there is many of them,
Yes.
but there is the most important
we
ones,
can see them on
which is Edfu, Komombo, Edfu, Komombo, and Philae temple. So now I can answer your question, Mahesti, which is you are very excited to know the answer. So the reason behind that is both there is a political and there is religious reason. So first of all, we'll go for the political reason. So think about like an Alexander or any other well-educated army leader taking over a country like Egypt, which has had a very strong religious foundations, which is the temples and ancient Egypt at that time. So he has two ways to rule the country. The first one is to take over everything, to humiliate the priests, to humiliate the current religion, to destroy the temples, to steal the wealth of the temples, like what the Persians did. But if he did that, he will make everybody in Egypt. So the other way is to use the temples, and that's what exactly happens. To use the temples and make a deal with the priests in that time to promote for these foreign kings, which is not native, as local rulers. By showing them dressed like pharaohs and their names written in hieroglyphics, introducing them to the public, which is they cannot read the hieroglyphics, they don't know the history, and they took every word which is said by a priest in that time or by the temple as a credit and as true, and to promote for these foreign kings as a native kings.
Yes, and we are seeing here some footages. I think that's
the beautiful Philae temple. You know, think about the Philae temple is not built during the native Egyptian kings. So it was built during the rule of Ptolemies and Romans. But as I mentioned earlier, that they haven't paid any money for that. And there is also another. I will come back to your point, which is also I talked about how they use the temples back in that time and the priests to promote for them. That was like a secret agreements between the rulers, the foreign rulers, and the priests of the temples to promote for them as long as they will keep them.
They are.
Exactly. So and they will keep their business, because temples was a very big business back in that time. So another evidence of what I'm saying is Rosetta Stone. the famous Rosetta Stone. So everybody knows the Rosetta Stone as helps greatly to decipher the secret of the ancient Egyptian language. But what people don't know about Rosetta Stone is the text written on it. It had a very deep and hidden meaning and revealing a very important things of ancient Egyptian history. The text is written by the ancient Egyptian priests thanking the king Ptolemy V for exempting them from paying the annual taxation. There is a hidden message here. The ancient Egyptian temples during the Greeks and Romans were subject to pay taxations.
Yes.
Because they have been exempted for 1 year because there was a famine. So, which is mean that that's a completely different story than the native Egyptian kings during Ramesses, during Amenhotep, New Kingdom, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom. They used to pay money for the temples, to build temples, and to keep the temples. So it shifted completely into collecting taxations from the temples during the Greek and Roman period. And that also explains why these temples, you know, like Philae Temple, like Edfu Temple, Komombo Temple, it took almost 200 years for each temple, between 100 to 200 years to be finished, to be completed, which is not common in Egyptian architectures. So we have kings like Ramesses, like Amenhotep. They built many temples during their rules, over 10 or 20 or 30 years at most. So what's happening? Why it took that long to build these temples? Because it was built from local funds. These poor priests, they have to save money, they have to pay their salaries, they have to pay their taxes, and then the leftover, they will use it for buildings. And that's why one temple during the Greek and Roman era, it took almost from 100 to 100 years to be completed. That's another evidence why I think that it was not built by native Egyptian, not built by the Greeks and Romans. So so we were talking about why, I told you about the political reason.
Yes.
But also there is a religious reason behind that. So the cornerstone of every ancient Egyptian temple is the pharaoh, is the king. Because the king in ancient Egypt is not only a political title, it's also a very high religious title. It's actually is the highest religious rank titles all over the country. So the king in ancient Egypt, he's a god and human. He is the one, the intermediate between gods and humans. Without the king, there is no temples. Without the king, because the king is only the king, he is the one who's allowed or permitted or have the authority to serve gods. And that's why, think about that, a temple without a king, without a pharaoh, offerings need to be given, connection between the god and the gods and people need to be made, and only the king who can make that. So which is mean that if the ancient Egyptian priests decided to build temples during the rule of the Greeks and Romans and not putting any pharaoh on the walls of the temples, it will not work, because the image of the pharaoh on the walls, it is a magical image. It helps to bring or it helps for the service to happen when the actual king is not to exist. So all of these hieroglyphics and carvings you go and see in the temples are magical for them. It's not decoration. They believe that these carvings, these images will come alive for the king himself, which is allowed to serve the gods. And that's explained a very interesting thing, and that's also proving my point that these kings had nothing to do with building these temples. So some of the, especially in the late Ptolemy period, there is oval shapes. Inside, there is nothing. There is no names. You see the image of the king, and you see an oval shape, which is called the Khartouche, and inside there is no names, has been written. Which is, if they really cared, or they will put their names inside. Or sometimes they put the word Per'a. Per'a literally means the great house. And the great house, Per'a, that is the root word for the pharaoh. So instead of writing down the name of the king Ptolemy XIII, for example, so they will put the name of the word, the title, pharaoh, instead. Because that's exactly what is needed, the title of the king, not the king himself. So there is many evidence proving that these kings had nothing to do with building these temples. And Rosetta Stone, as I mentioned, is one of them. And also how long it took, which is over 100 years, to finish every temple. Another thing as well, so the art during this period declined much. And instead of the innovative and very deep meaning art in Karnak and Luxor and Abydos, you will be struck by reputation everywhere in Philae Temple. I know that Philae Temple is very beautiful. I know that Dandara is very beautiful. But for those who are specialized in art, when they go and look at the temples, for those tour guides who would like to go and explain the temples, they get bored after 15 minutes, because it is the same scene, the same picture, the same image repeated all over the world. There is not much innovation, simply because the art school in ancient Egypt, which is used to be promoted and paid by the ancient Egyptian kings, the native kings, is no longer exist. Nobody paying for art, nobody paying for temples anymore, and that's why the poor artist, which is don't have an innovation anymore, so you're just copying as stencils, copying and
There's
repeating.
no creativity, there's no innovation.
No. And there was a decline, but the good thing, the good side, that they are very well preserved because they are
Mr.
newer.
Samir, finally, are these temples, the Roman Greek temples, are different from other temples?
That's another very good question. Yes, so one of the difference is the reputation. The art is declined.
Yes.
So it's very well preserved. Compared. Very well preserved because simply it is newer than the other temples. We
Yes.
have temples
There's
like
a good,
4,000 years, and the other like 2,000 years. They are very well
Yes.
preserved. The ceiling decoration of Dandara temple is amazing. It's beautiful because
Yes.
very well preserved, and that's give us a very good deal about lots of information about how astronomy in ancient Egypt.
So finally, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Samir Abbas, Egyptologist. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you very much,
You're
sir. Always a pleasure. And that, our viewers, would bring us to the end of this edition of The Breakfast Show. You were in the company of my dear colleague Shireen Adel and myself, Mahisti Rabia. Thank you very much, Shireen.
Thank you, Mahisti. Thank you, dear viewers, and see you tomorrow with a new